welcome back. It's the HD episode of the podcast, if you can tell the uptick in audio quality as I hold the mic like a wine glass. And coincidentally,
Beautiful.
we're doing HD, the poet you may remember from Briar's episode. Or you might remember her in relation to the writer Ezra Pound, who got charged with treason against the US at the end of World War II, or maybe in relation to the less controversial William Carlos Williams.
Or you might remember her as one of Freud's patients, or her interesting time with Havelock Ellis. This is one of the few people that I actually know something about, and it's because her life is wild.
As always, though, we start at the beginning, which is less wild. H.D. was born Hilda Doolittle in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania on September 10th, 1886. She was the second child of a pack of boys born to an astronomy professor who fought in the U.S. Civil War and who also had two sons from his first marriage. Now we get very religious here early on because there were a lot of Moravians in Bethlehem at this time and in H.D.'s family. Now, I admit I'm a bit off kilter here in talking about Moravian religious doctrine, so there may be a few mistakes or just generalizations. Moravianism is a Czech branch of Protestantism that actually formed before Martin Luther's Reformation. So the Moravian belief is based on sharing the love of Jesus, who is recognized as God, the fountainhead of all love. From this, you get a heavy emphasis on going out and converting people throughout the world. I bring the Moravians up because it impacts Hilda's childhood a lot. For instance, she'd sit in a church where men and women are segregated across the aisle after having to enter through gender-designated doors. Women also had to wear small white caps, which H.D.'s grandmother also wore at home.
I'm getting kind of an Amish vibe from that, having the special clothes that you have to wear.
In terms of values, Moravians resembled the Puritans and other Calvinists with their emphasis on industriousness. H.D. would go on to inherit this Protestant work ethic from her father, who dedicated himself to his work both teaching and writing textbooks. We've seen hints of this, I think, in Briar's episode, though I think I left out snippets of Briar talking about how she once made the mistake of interrupting H.D. at work, and H.D. then tore to shreds what she'd been writing. After that, Briar never interrupted her again. But back to H.D.'s childhood. Her family moved from Bethlehem to Upper Darby outside of Philadelphia when she was 9, because her father accepted a position at the University of Pennsylvania. Despite being able to hire a cook, her mother was still very busy between 6 kids and a rotation of visiting relatives, so H.D. felt she didn't see her much. That isn't to say that H.D. was isolated. She made friends with girls her own age, and one, Margaret, would later be instrumental in introducing H.D. to Ezra Pound via Margaret's brother. But he comes later.
Oh, tease.
Right now, there is the mysterious and oft-written incident of H.D.'s father returning home one day with a bleeding head. Now, despite being written of both by herself in fiction and in letters to people like Havelock Ellis, an early psychologist, the tale is confusing. We don't quite know what happened, as she usually wrote about it as if it was a mystery, but he may have been hit by a passing streetcar near their house. The reason I bring this up is because it sounds like she had nightmares about it even as an adult. She speaks of his life being despaired of at that time, and it even makes its way into her writing. In short, it was a big deal for her. It also keeps coming up in her forays into early therapy with Ellis and then Freud, to whom she admits to believing that she would join her father in death when she thought she'd die in childbirth.
So wait, did he die of this?
I don't think so. Like, I know we're jumping around timeline-wise, but it doesn't sound like he died from this. It sounds like he continued in the world of the living.
Hmm. It just was really scary.
Yeah, and also, I think to anyone losing or possibly losing a parent you're close to or look up to is scary, even if you're an adult, let alone when you are less than 18, somewhere between like
Right,
10
and
and
still
18.
right, still relying on them. Yeah. No, no, I can see how that would be a fairly earth-shattering event.
So, sometime after this event, HD gets sent to Miss Gordon's school in West Philly, where she's unhappy despite the presence of her best friend. She then transfers to the Friends Central School, which she graduates from in 1905 at the age of 18 or 19. After that, she enters Bryn Mawr College. And you know, Pixie, it's been a while, I think, since we've had our alma mater pop up on this podcast.
Yeah, I can't remember exactly when we've talked about it before, but I thought it was Eva Palmer for some reason. Didn't she visit?
Eva is a fellow alum.
How is she?
I think the last time it would have come up would have been Martha Gellhorn, who also attended.
Yeah, no, we've got some Bryn Mawr people in this crowd.
If you are also a part of this crowd, you can comment what the color of your lantern is.
I'm just doing it like vote now in the comments. Which color is superior? But don't do that.
We don't need the battle of the colors to play out in the comments section. Now, at Bryn Mawr, HD's tastes leaned towards the classics, and she also did well at basketball since she was about 5'11".
I think this is our first lady who is a basketball player, so kudos, HD.
I want to say Janet Flanner also played basketball for a while, but I don't remember for certain.
Well, no, that's a fun dig to go on later.
I bring this up with HG because her height actually embarrassed her when shopping for ready made clothes, as those clothes tended not to fit well, a struggle at which we can all shake our heads at in collective disappointment, especially when it comes to pockets.
Yeah, seriously.
HD did not entirely mesh with the Bryn Mawr crowd. Living off campus, she missed out on a lot of the in-jokes and community events that made Bryn Mawr a positive experience for so many. I'm going to backtrack a little bit here to 4 years before this in 1901, because at age 15, she meets Ezra Pound at a Halloween party. She said, "He drags me out of shadows."
Ooh.
He was already a student in his first year at the University of Pennsylvania, alongside the poet William Carlos Williams, who knew them both. Now, back to Bryn Mawr in 1905, because this is when Pound and HD really start to hang around each other. Hilda did make some friends at Bryn Mawr, though, like the poet Marianne Moore. From Moore, we have a description of Hilda at this time. "I remember Hilda passing the bush by Taylor Hall in a great hurry on the path leading from Rockefeller Hall and the Bryn Mawr Village to Dalton Hall, the science building. She struck me as being extremely humanitarian and detached, as if she would not insult you by coldness in the necessary and at longest brief moment of mutual inspection. But I felt that she was not interested in the life of the moment. I remember her eyes which glittered and gave me an impression of great acuteness and were, as I said, sunny and genial at the time. I remember her seeming to lean forward as if resisting a high wind, and have the impression of the toe of one foot turning in a little and giving an effect of positiveness and willfulness. I thought of her as an athlete, I believe. Hilda's being a non-resident was very much to the loss of the resident members of the class." A contradiction, then, to HD's own recollection that, of course, I was practically invisible when I was there.
And I gotta say, when I was there, I was not watching everyone walking that path that closely. My goodness.
No, I think we all kind of blended together, but that may have been partly the effect of the free box and all of us wearing each other's cast off clothes.
That might be it. Now, did she and Marianne have anything that we know of, or Marianne was just looking at her?
They were just friends, Pixie.
Okay, I'm just saying, might as well raise it since we're here and HD's by and everyone's fair game. I know how this goes, but you've been dropping some hints here and there that she is, uh, despite certain members of the class appreciating her, she is generally feeling alienated, isolated. What is the result of this?
So, yeah, Hilda would say she dropped out of college mid sophomore year because she was ill and hinted at a nervous breakdown. In reality, she failed English to her shock and confusion. She also did badly in her other classes. This brings us back to Ezra Pound, the actual cause of her dropping out, which she regretted later on. You see, she was engaged to marry him, which her family disapproved of because they disapproved of him.
And how exactly did this cause her to drop out?
It has been described as it was either Pound or Bryn Mawr, and she chose Pound. For further clarification, it was basically demanding her attention man or demanding of her attention institution.
Mhm.
That said, HD never married Pound.
Wait, so what happened? She dropped out of school for him.
The wedding was called off, and he may have cheated on her.
Oh boy, messy.
While she later acknowledged that it was a good thing she didn't marry him, that sentiment was a while in coming. The awakened interest in Greek drama was not a consolation to either herself or her family, especially as she was the only one of the family to not graduate from college.
Oh, yeah, so that's going to be a difficult social thing for her in her family life.
So Ezra Pound left for Europe, and Hilda was stuck living with her brother and his wife, whom she disliked. She decided she needed a female friend of her age. Enter Frances Gregg, only 2 years older than Hilda. They then became more than friends.
Mm.
Hilda would continue to write about Frances years after their relationship ended, but before that, there was still Pound, who wrote that he was returning to New York. Hilda decided she would be there. Her parents were relieved to send her to what they thought was a literary work trip. As it turned out, they hated Frances even more than they had Ezra.
Oh boy.
What does it say about you when practically no one approves of your choice of lovers?
Well, maybe that she has the wrong group of friends.
True, but I don't think anyone would approve of Pound dating their friend.
Yeah, no, he doesn't seem to be a great guy, but well.
So off, HD went to stay with a friend in Greenwich Village. This short stint in 1910 was not a good time. She didn't like living there, and Pound continued to neglect her, which preoccupied her. She had expected him to act as he had back in Upper Darby, as a college student flirting with her, and not as a recognized poet with a hankering for Americans, to give him the same reception he had for his work abroad. In short, he ignored her in favor of work.
Come on, dude. She gave up her whole college career for you. I mean, not that they should end up together, but still, that's a pretty dick move on his part.
So, with no connections or work done, HD returned to her parents' orbit. She then proceeded to epistolarily court Pound, which worked somehow because he announced he'd visit her when he visited his parents nearby.
But, like, really? Why? He is not giving her anything. Why is she doing this?
For some reason, this man seems to have two modes when it came to her: ignore and obsess over. And no, dear listener, I do not regret using obsess over because even biographers agree. He did not stay, of course, and returned to
Of
England.
course. God.
So, with Pound back in England, there is next a plan for Hilda and Francis's mother to travel to Europe. HD's parents agreed to a 4-month trip in the spring of 1911. Despite the chaperone, there was still canoodling in an empty lifeboat away from everyone else prior to a large storm on the passage over. Sadly, peace on that front did not continue after landing in France and England. The widow accused HD of stealing her daughter from her and of corrupting her morals.
Oh boy.
HD argued that Francis's mother was stifling her daughter and preventing her from having a life.
Yeah, that doesn't sound like a very fun vacation.
And of course, there was also Pound in England. In fact, HD was relieved when the Greggs decided to return home, leaving her in England with Ezra. Despite the complications with him, she enjoyed herself. In fact, it's during this time that HD is introduced at a party in 1912 to Richard Aldington, 6 years younger than her and only 20 at the time. He was a poet who worked as a sports journalist. He fell in love with her and was sympathetic to the relationship she had with Francis. In addition, she wanted to stay in England. The easiest way to stay in a country, both then and now, is to marry a native.
Oh
Now,
boy. This is looking hasty.
not as hasty as some. Now, before that, HD received word that Francis had married back in America and would be visiting England with her husband in 1912. HD even agreed to join them on a trip to Brussels. But Pound showed up at the dock, grabbed HD, and told her that Francis had a chance to be happy, which would be ruined if HD went on the trip. So, HD didn't go.
Can't decide if he's being a possessive creep in this moment or actually being a good friend, because maybe she should be letting Francis go.
Why not both?
Fair enough.
After all, I do not know the mind of Ezra Pound.
So she's not going on this trip. What is she doing instead?
Instead, she remained dealing with the beginning of the Imagist movement and getting to know Aldington. Imagism was a shift in the understanding of what makes a poem work. It focused on powerful images described through clear, free verse language reminiscent of some Japanese and ancient Greek poetry. By the start of 1913, HD was a published poet in the magazine Poetry, which Pound was a foreign editor for, and which Aldington was also published in. For a time, HD was the only female poet connected to the new movement, until the poet Amy Lowell showed up. She has even been called the Goddess of Imagism, though I am uncertain how much of that is due to her fondness for dress-up, play acting, and making an entrance at events.
Sounds like fun. And hey, if the ready-mades don't fit, then, might as well get something fancy.
Then, on October 18th, 1913, HD married Richard Aldington at a Kensington registry office with her parents and Ezra Pound as a witness. So HD now settled in England for what she thought was permanently. She was riding high. Richard thought her more distinguishable than Ezra at this time, and the poet Amy Lowell was pulled into her orbit. Biographers have called this her happiest and most exciting period of her life before the Great War roared in. Unfortunately, in short order, Pound married in 1914 and left Imagism for Vorticism. The explanation I found for what that is this. It centered around the idea that at the vertex there was the center of energy. In Imagism, the center of energy was the image.
And that means what exactly?
To be frank, I have no idea.
Fair enough.
What I do know is that HD did not join. And then there was World War I. The same day the war was announced, HD experienced her own personal bombshell. She discovered she was pregnant. The doctor urged her to go ahead and have the child. It ended with a stillborn that HD would tie to the news of the sinking of the Lusitania in 1915, possibly as a way to deal with the fact that she hadn't wanted the kid. As a result, HD developed a fear of pregnancy and refused to have sex with her husband.
This sounds like a rough time.
It was. Aldington went and had affairs in London, which HD knew about. Rather than resolving this through conversation, he ended up conscripted in 1916. On one of his leaves and with her permission, he became the official lover of an Arabella York. HD found her own lover in the composer Cecil Gray, who invited her to Cornwall. And then she became pregnant again, this time by her lover.
I thought she wasn't doing that kind of sex. But okay, HD. Oh, so is there abortion at this point? Like, would she be able to safely, get rid of it since she doesn't want to have a child?
I would not say safely, though other women on our podcast have aborted unwanted children before.
Mm-hmm.
In this case, in order to settle if HD should have the child, she decided that if a swallow flew into her room, that it was a mystical sign that she should give birth. A swallow flew into her room.
Wow. That's a very unlikely thing to have happen, I feel like. So interesting that it did. So okay, so she's gonna have the baby. Is she gonna start a new family with this gray guy?
No. By July 1918, HD realized she did not love Gray, who may or may not have known about this child, as their relationship was deteriorating.
Oh no.
In fact, for unknown reasons, Gray would only visit this child once when she stayed with a friend of his on the island of Capri. So Gray was out, and Aldington was not much better. He was not as sympathetic now.
Yeah, I wonder why. She's like, I'm not having sex because I don't want to get pregnant. And he's like, okay. And then here she is. And it's not even his kid. I mean, I understand that there's some trauma involved, but I get where he's coming from.
Despite being demobilized in the fall of 1918, he said he would not be able to visit her before she would need to go to a hospital. He also said he had no money for her and the child. And this was quite the about-face from before, as he'd given her a blank check in case of his death at the front, and had then insisted that she receive his army pay.
Wow, okay, yeah.
To further complicate things, he would write things like, "Damn it, Dooley, I believe in women having all the lovers they want if they're in love with them." However, there is evidence as well that he felt he had a moral obligation to his lover, Arabella. That if he left, she would be a fallen woman.
As opposed to when they were together, where they were only living in sin to use that frame of mind, because I mean, obviously, current morals are different, but this is a really difficult time for everyone involved, it sounds like.
To further complicate things, because we can never make anything more simple, by this point, HD has met the writer Briar, who she refers to in letters to Aldington when she says things like, I love you, but I desire l'autre. In fact, Briar's entrance coincided with his exit, which may partly account for his about-face attitude. Either way, HD quickly realized that Briar was in love with her. As she wrote a friend, no man has ever cared for me like that. However, HD was ambivalent. The intensity made her cautious. In Briar's episode, I mentioned how basically they both wanted the other to save them, and HD realized that. She'd write that she wanted to take from this girl, not give to her. The biographer Barbara Guest here says that this is the dilemma that faced her all her life. The answer was that HD could never take without giving, try though she might. There followed the brief separation as HD mulled over what to do. She had wanted a protector and was embarrassed that such was not the case here. Yet she joined her fate to Briar's, helping the younger woman get out from under her parents. In return, Briar saved HD's life when the poet was sick with Spanish flu and her landlady expected her to die while pregnant. Briar was the one to ensure that HD got better medical care and paid for the costs. In a way, I'd say there were at least times where they saved each other, even if other times proved filled with friction.
Yeah, it seems like right now they do need someone in their corner, and they're willing to be there for each other in the ways that matter.
Speaking of pregnancy and saving, HD gave birth to her daughter, Frances Perdita, on March 31st, 1919. And yes, her first name was HD's first girlfriend's name, Frances Gregg.
Because HD can't do one thing without it being messy.
The drama with Aldington also ensued again. He did not want the baby to have his name, and according to HD's account, threatened to sue for divorce on the grounds she was an adulteress.
Oh, that's rich coming from him.
In fact, she countered with the same threat. Guest believes that HD was desperate not only for a father's name for her daughter, but also to ensure that illegitimacy did not touch her. Briar could be fine being a bastard, but not everyone was fine with their own daughter being so, especially when the child's mother was already married. Either way, HD outmaneuvered him and registered Perdita under the name Aldington. He then told Briar that HD had to get gone at once. After briefly staying at Pound's flat, HD went back to Briar.
HD is collecting X's, like she's trying to play tic-tac-toe.
I love the analogy, but I don't know what to do with it. Moving on, thereafter, one of the nicknames HD and Briar used for Aldington was Cuthbert, for it related to a depiction of cowards during World War I. From this time also comes a promise between the two women. Briar was never to threaten suicide, and in return, HD told her the truth about Perdita's father. She also made Briar promise to grow up, so to speak, and to take care of the girl. Briar at 24 could still be rather childish.
She's only 24? Oh my god, yeah. I could see her not quite being ready to handle a kid. I mean, I guess, different norms for the time. But wow, yeah.
From here, their relationship for several decades was a bit like pupil and teacher. HD had the creative life that Briar yearned for and soaked up by being around her, while also admiring HD as a poet. Also, the biographer guest has posited that HD never found Breyer physically attractive and that it didn't reach the levels of passion she had with Francis Gregg. Guest even says that when HD did have a woman lover, she tended to confuse that person with Francis.
Now, Guest says this, but we do have that quote a while back about desiring l'autre, right?
Yes, and for those who are confused, l'autre is French for the other, so desiring the other.
Yeah. So she desires her. I feel like that implies a level of physical attraction.
I mean, at this point, I just put it down to how HD speaks and writes and the levels of drama she ends up in.
I mean, I guess the other thing that we should point out too is that HD may not be sure herself what she's feeling, because bisexuality is not normal at this time. There are not a lot of examples of it that she could be looking at, and so she is pretty confused about what she's experiencing.
Very true. I am used to thinking about the other bisexuals on this podcast who have an easier time dealing with it, I think.
And I've had community, I've had other people to bounce off with, and she has had, a few women here and there, but it's seems like isolated affairs rather than connecting to a wider subculture.
And speaking of confusion, in the midst of all this, HD found Havelock Ellis, one of the pioneers in the field of psychology at the time, and one whose words on the field I doubt as much as Freud.
He was into that whole inversion thing, and that if you were attracted to your own gender, that must mean that you have a bit of the other gender inside you, and that whole thing.
HD was looking for answers to the hurt and ambiguity in her life, an explanation for her bisexuality, some way of bearing with her trauma. He had her pee on him because it got him off.
Lovely guy.
My bone of contention here is specifically having a patient urinate on him for sexual purposes. Like, even if the patient consents, your whole purpose is to help them, not the other way around, and just so many medical malpractice lines crossed. So, anyway, Hilda refused initially to let him include the description of that episode in his book, The Fountain of Life, but he convinced her that her identity wouldn't be found out from it. Now, quickly leaving that episode behind, Ellis did help her get over at least some of her hang-ups around sex, so he was at least helpful despite all that.
And despite being a eugenicist, but we can move on.
Going back to writing, though, HD had been continually writing and getting published throughout this time, both in the UK and the US. Her poems use the Imagist freestyle verse and tend to be quite focused on ancient Greece, a continuing interest for her. At least 14 of her poems appeared in print in 1919 and 1920. Her work also appeared in practically every major literary magazine, and so often in poetry, that people quipped she must be hiding from real life under a chiton.
I love it. I mean, hey, if the psychoanalysis doesn't work, then just get really into ancient Greece.
Anyway, not long after this, HD and Breyer, with Perdita, took a trip to America where Breyer met and married Robert McAlmon, if you remember from the previous episode. HD approved of this. In McAlmon, she'd have someone else to help manage Breyer's moods and to keep her away from her parents. All three would take turns watching the kid on the way back while the others wrote, including a correspondence with the poet Marianne Moore, with whom she could be more open than others. In fact, HD wrote, "I am beginning to feel as if the world approved of me, and I can't write unless I am an outcast. I have tried everything. I have been respectable, and I have been not respectable. And now I am mediocre." Quite the dilemma of notice me but ignore me, and everything I write doesn't meet my internal expectations, it sounds like.
She's too successful to be an outcast.
Now I am going to veer away, zoom out a bit here. HD tended to avoid politics. She did not take up with the suffragettes. In fact, she showed little care for the social and economic plights of women. She also had a fear of travel on top of claustrophobia in crowds. She feared taxis would run her over and that a chicken dish might contain cat meat. Paris also frightened her during the interwar period. The new set of expats, the cafes, and the nightlife puzzled her. She felt awkward and old among them. This would be why she didn't settle in Paris as so many other women of the podcast did. Instead, HD would spend quite a bit of time in England. In fact, she took out a 7-year lease on a flat in 1925.
Yeah, it sounds like for all her adventurousness in some ways, she is not adventurous all the way.
At this time, Frances Gregg was living in London and separated from her husband. Her financial fortunes had fallen since she'd last seen HD, who initially was so shocked that she avoided Frances. HD's emotions around her were also complicated.
Yeah, I can imagine she'd have some complicated emotions. This sounds like the setup for a rom-com.
It's funny you should say that, because they still met, and it was Frances who introduced Kenneth McPherson to HD in 1926, when HD was 40 and Kenneth was 24.
So it's not the meet cute you'd expect, but there was something romantic happening.
Briar, meanwhile, wanted to be rid of McAlmon and his wild drinking parties. So marrying Kenneth for HD was convenient. This was further helped by Kenneth trying very hard to get on Briar's good side because he was aware of her relationship with Hilda.
So he's in the loop.
He is in the loop, and Briar got divorced in 1927 and married Kenneth that same year. The three then went on a honeymoon to Venice. The location was HD's choice. Unfortunately, Briar didn't like it. There's a snippet where HD is sitting happily and in a costume with a sour-faced and severely dressed Briar across from her and a preening McPherson between them.
Oh boy.
Sometime later, all three would be living in Switzerland.
And I guess we should clarify here for anyone who didn't listen to the previous episode that Briar has to have dibs on the guy because HD can't because she's still married.
Yeah, she hasn't divorced Aldington yet.
So consequently, the Metamors, as I guess they're called, must be technically married to cement this polycule.
It is also now that we come to their creation of the Pool Group, which was mainly a film magazine, but also a film group. They didn't care for Hollywood's style of production, you see. In fact, they thought Greta Garbo was ruined by going to LA. Their magazine was the first one devoted to film, and it continued for about 6.5 years until 1933. It was more successful than expected, but most people in the US, I'd say, are more aware of the form borderline coming out of this group. We mentioned it in the Briar episode. HD appears in it as the character of Astrid. The theme of the film was about people being in between groups, places, and a sort of half-world, from what I've gathered. If you want, you can find it on YouTube. That said, HD also didn't stop her own writing. During the 20s and 30s, she continued to write poetry and also started writing fiction and a bit of non-fiction in addition to her magazine contributions. On top of also having to cut and assemble the film Borderline with Briar because Kenneth took to his bed complaining about a bad throat. The Germans liked the film, according to Briar, but the English did not. As to HD herself during the creation of the 1930 film, She thoroughly enjoyed herself. She got to be dramatic and briefly had a crush on the professional actor who plays the main role of the film. Both Briar and Kenneth thought of her as their own Garbo during the filming.
Well, that sounds like fun. And we know that she likes to wear costumes, so.
The psychoanalysis hasn't left either, because at 47, HD started meeting with Freud. He told HD that she was the perfect example of a bisexual. He told her that she got stuck at the earliest pre-Oedipal stage and that her triangle is mother-brother-self. She had had the baby with the brother, hence Richard Aldington, Cecil Gray, Kenneth, etc. Of her writing, he said that she hid two things, that she's a boy and that she's a girl. A rather literal take on the word bisexual.
I think that his meaning was, in fact, that she's bisexual in the sense of being both a boy and a girl. Because that's the whole inversion theory. As everyone knows, you can't actually be a woman who likes a woman. You must, in fact, have a bit of man in you, and that man likes women.
Excuse you, I did not swallow some random twin while in the room.
Freud would beg to differ.
He also said that she really just wanted to be an actress, and that is why she was never satisfied with writing. Meanwhile, he charged her through Briar about $25 a session, while medical care in Vienna at the time was almost free, and the typical wage of a secretary was $20 a month in a rent-cheap city. Admittedly, Briar was also partially financially backing the whole psychoanalytical movement in Vienna at the time via their magazine and giving money to analysts in need. After this, HD tends to be a bit further afield from Briar and feeling less conflicted due to the fact that Briar had more money and paid for things. Hence her move to London as the Pull Group came to a close. You remember when I said HD was oblivious to politics?
Yeah, we kind of get that through her association with certain persons.
This continued through the 30s. Unlike many, she did not get involved with the Spanish Civil War. She did get involved with flirting with the writer Elizabeth Bowen, whom HD had a crush on and believed was a lesbian with male lovers as a smokescreen. It does not appear that anything came of this, much to HD's disappointment. Meanwhile, Richard Aldington now asked for divorce as he wanted to marry Bridget Patmore's daughter and have a kid with her.
Didn't he have a different lover last time we checked in on him?
It's been over 10 years.
Okay. And I guess he only cared about making her an honest woman a bit.
So drama ensued, and he became insistent as his lover ended up pregnant months later, and the kid was expected in 1938. HD only agreed then because it reminded her of having Perdita and the drama with Richard over her legitimacy. That said, HD enjoyed the drama of being the forsaken wife, though without acting maliciously. Malice stayed in the comments. The divorce came through on June 22, 1938, with Richard as the guilty party and forced to pay damages. However, he was broke basically and begged her to pay for everything as his kid was expected to be born any day at this point. HD agreed.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tough situation.
Perdita, meanwhile, had to deal with all the confusion and stress caused on top of her mother's need for privacy that resulted in being sent to school and then another. Thankfully, she was now 18 and could move to London to be near HD. And now we also come to World War II. Stuck in London. It's the only time that Briar and HD live in the same building for an extended period of time, rather like Romaine Brooks and Natalie Barney getting stuck in Italy during the same time. Weirdly enough, HD was quite productive writing-wise during this episode. What she calls trilogy came out of this. It was several poems. There were also a couple of novels. At one point in 1943, her name appeared with other writers on notices in London for a poetry reading that several royals also attended.
All right, top of her game.
Her daughter, meanwhile, was out driving a volunteer canteen service in bombing raids and getting involved with counterintelligence for the war effort. By this point, Kenneth McPherson is gone as well. He was back in the States. On top of that, Frances Gray got bombed with her house and didn't make it.
That must have been a blow.
There was also a mental breakdown for HD that Breyer dealt with, but there isn't much written about it. We do know she was hospitalized with electric shock treatment and then caught some virus. And now, 60 after the war, HD hit her stride with writing yet again. Many of her poems and books come out during this period, but 7 years later, she abruptly had to have an operation for abdominal intestinal occlusion in January 1953. They had to remove part of her intestines or HD would have died. Later that year, she had to have a second operation. Throughout the years post-World War II, HD nearly taught at Bryn Mawr and was also offered a speaking gig at Convocation. But due to continued ill health and ambivalent feelings for her somewhat alma mater, that never occurred. Instead, she remained mostly in Switzerland, even as the BBC broadcast her work. At one point, HD even won the gold medal from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, though she had to accept it at Yale. There were further citations and honors from colleges and literary associations that she did not always travel to receive due to various pains from advancing age, and to some of her friends, it was obvious that she was growing frail. Then, at age 75, HD had a repeat of the 1918 health crisis, so to speak, where Breyer once again had to order about for better medical care, only this time it wasn't enough. During a telephone call, HD had suddenly had a stroke. She was paralyzed and unable to speak. When she was brought in, medical staff did not believe she would last through the night. By the time Breyer arrived, HD was already slipping away. The day before she died, she received the copy of her latest to-be-published book, Helen in Egypt. It is unlikely that she could even recognize it, and so HD died in Switzerland on September 27th, 1961. She was buried back in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, where her story began. She had chosen her epitaph a few years before that. I think I did get what I was looking for from life and art.
At least she projects this air of satisfaction in the end.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Paris Lesbos. For more episodes, find us on your podcast app of choice. We're also on YouTube, where we love to hear your ideas for new episodes. And remember, C's may get degrees, but dropouts can still hear their poetry on the BBC.